The Black Myths podcast is an informative conversational show analyzing popular myths about Black culture of a socio-political nature.
Translation, we just debunking the bullshit that be said about Black people. Welcome to the Black Myths podcast. Welcome to the Black Myths podcast. We are here today. So your host, Too Black, and Shell is back from the dead.
I have arisen.
We haven't heard from her in a while, but she's back with us. How you doing, Shell?
I'm here, living, excelling.
That's what's up. Today we are doing a local myth on the local for Indianapolis. For those who may listen to the show and don't know where it's based out of, local myth in relation to Indianapolis, Indiana, Unigov. Now, some people might want to hop out like this doesn't relate to us because, you know, we're not from here, but all cities have demolished Black neighborhoods and built capitalism on top of it. So this really isn't that unique. This is just a story that you'll probably find in some form in any city you live in America and really around the world probably. So, so I would encourage you, if you feel like you're leaving to stay, because I think this is a necessary story to hear, and it might relate to your local history, even if the specifics aren't the exact same. But you will hear streets and schools that you may not have heard of, but it all relates to the same system we're talking about. So with us to discuss this is Dr. Olin Dotson. He is a professor at Ball State University. How you doing, Dr. Dotson? And I'll let you introduce yourself further.
All right. Yes, my name is Olin Dotson. I teach in the College of Architecture and Planning in architecture. And I'm just glad to be here tonight and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
All right. Thanks for being with us, man. I appreciate it. And, you've worked in, would you say architecture or real estate, or how do you divide those two things just for people who are trying to?
Well, my background academically was or is in architecture. And when I started working for firms, I became more interested in development. So I went back and pursued a Master of Science in Real Estate Development at Columbia, and then came out and started working, doing very large, complex, mixed financed public housing developments around the country, starting in Indianapolis, but working in other cities as well. And then I found my way back to the academy and started teaching about 22 years ago. And for a while I was teaching and practicing. However, I transitioned pretty much totally into teaching about around 2008.
Okay. So you had a pretty extensive history in this in this subject matter.
From all different angles.
Around the country. I worked on I have my college roommate, Clay Dorsey, down in Birmingham. We worked together and we did the Negro League Museum in Birmingham and Tuggle Elementary School, where Angela Davis and several other prominent citizens attended. We did we worked on with Brian Stevenson down in Montgomery, Alabama on the Memorial to Peace and Justice. We did the Memorial to Peace and Justice Center, and that led us to doing some work with the Southern Poverty Law Center as well, the Civil Rights Memorial. Just finished that up a few weeks ago. So I'm still in practice, but my primary focus is in the academy and teaching social and environmental justice at Ball State.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. And one more quick shout out. I almost forgot. I want to shout out the Center for Black Literature and Culture and the Indianapolis Public Library, who's been our partners for this Black Myths of Black History series that we're having this month. And a special shout out to Miss Michelle Hayes, who has been very intricate in helping us put this together. So want to make sure we reference our partners. So anyway, moving on to the myth itself. Again, we said we're going to talk about Unigov. Unigov honestly is not something that even a lot of people know in general, even within Indianapolis. So the myth today is Unigov was good for Black people. So we're just gonna give you kind of a breakdown of how we understand it, me and Shell, and then we're gonna kick it to Dr. Dotson. So Shell, what is your understanding as just being a lifelong citizen of Indianapolis, which I am not?
So Unigov was a hot ass mess. To make it very short and concise, I don't even know how to summarize it up. It was so much. It was a bunch of policies that changed how Indianapolis looked, how Indianapolis functioned, and specifically split up Black neighborhoods, destroyed a lot of Black businesses, stole a lot of Black land, and kind of got us stuck with the shitty school districts that we have today.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. So, yeah, my understanding, I didn't even, when I first moved to Nap, I hadn't even heard of it. And then,
Oh, I forgot the highways. We did get highways.
yeah, that's technically a separate program, but we'll get to that. But yeah, when I first moved to Nap, I didn't even really know about it. You know, but once I learned about it, it wasn't surprising. I guess for me, I just saw it as a continuation of how this always goes. Because the myth is Indianapolis or Unigov was good for Black Indianapolis, and the way they pitched that the city is it was a sacrifice that needed to be made. So even though Black people didn't win anything really out of this policy, it helped Indianapolis as a city expand. It helped it add way more population. It raised the tax base so they could get the convention center downtown and build skyscrapers, even though downtown's never really been that much of a skyscraper in Indianapolis. But it gave Indianapolis a tax base to expand to become a quote unquote modern city. And we know, you know, we're in a settler colony, we're in the United States. So it's always been about, okay, these people need to take the L so we can expand and we can grow, and then we'll kick it back around to them, but they never do. Like that's been the story since, you know, they landed here. Whether it was to Native people, whether that was to Black people, whether that was poor white people, or whatever. That's so Unigov for me was just an extension of that. But before we get to Unigov specifically, it's important to deal with kind of what was happening right before that. And for the record, Unigov happens around 1970, 1969, 1970. So Dr. Dodson, I know there was, Shell already brought it up, the issue of the I65 and I70. And again, to our listeners, interstates being built through the hood is a national problem. So could you just talk a little bit about that?
It is a national problem. And of course, some of it is just blatant racism and the structural systems that have been set up because of our history of blatant racism have contributed to the disparity that result in depressed land values. And then, of course, lack of access to voice and power. So we see that in Paradise Valley and the Black Bottom in Detroit. We see that on the south side of Chicago with the Dan Ryan. We see it on Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where, you know, after burning it down and rebuilding it, they ran the interstate right through the middle of it. And we saw it here with I65 and I70, not only with the Black community, but with poor white communities as well that don't have any voice. And so when you get that kind of situation, you know, they're going to always, interstates basically follow the path of least resistance. And of course, with us, even if there is resistance, it doesn't matter. So we see the nature of it and how it divides communities, how it separates, how it destroys, and how it results in erasure, and how it accelerates devaluation of land, which makes it easier for others to come in and complete that erasure, you know, like IUPUI did.
And around this time period, who or what was the leadership that was responsible for the construction of the highway and the land acquisition that ended up helping complete the projects?
Well, I mean, the whole interstate system really started much earlier, right after World War II, or even during the Eisenhower administration. And it was actually sold to the American public as something that would help with our safety. in the event of a Russian attack or something, as we're at the height of the Cold War, and people building dugouts in their backyards and worrying about pressing buttons and anti-communist interrogation of our people, and so that was just part of it. So it was easy to get national support for this Highways and Defense Act. And so connecting cities, and not only connecting cities, but actually passing through cities was commonplace all over the country. When we talk about Detroit, for example, the thought was that if we can build these interstates and connect downtown to the suburbs, then it'll allow usher more people to come into the city. But actually, it just made it easier for them to escape.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what the mission of these interstates are when it relates to inner cities, is providing high-speed navigation to escape the inner city and support the expansion of suburbs. We see that in every city in the United States. We just see it in different forms, but it's all the same with an outer belt around the perimeter, so that I can remain out there and go from one interstate to the next, or to my gated enclave, or wherever I want to go. So it's just universal.
So it's my understanding, especially talking to you previous to this, about there were different plans as far as where the interstate was going to be built and what neighborhoods it was going to be built through. Could you talk a little bit about what some of those original plans were, and then how it ended up, and how that plays into this idea of, like you said, Black people didn't necessarily have the power, even when we did resist, to push back against a lot of these, as Shell talked about, acquisitions.
This is Crispus Attucks right here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So this thing, where you get off of the freeway and you drive right in front of Crispus Attucks, and you get off and go down 11th Street like that.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a freeway continuing on down through the Ransom Place neighborhood. And this is the Walker Center. So they have one side of this freeway on one side of the Walker and the northbound on the other side.
Mm.
And this went right on down through what's now Military Park and right up. So I can get here and go out and go north or go east to get the hell out of here. And so they planned, this is before they tore down half of Lockfield, but this was to tear down all of Lockfield here and take all of this. This is 1970. And then this is future research. This is Ransom Place. And then future city housing. So I think they imagined taking the people that lived in Lockfield and moving them over here, which is Fayette Street. And then they were going to build a stadium right here where Bethel is, Bethel AME Church. They're going to build a stadium there.
And why didn't they do this? Why didn't they go through with this original plan?
I think they just did as much as they could. I think that the freeway, they ended up just doing the freeway like this, and 70, and then 65, 70, and then 65 here, and not doing this freeway. I think if they had done this freeway, all this land would have been devalued, including Ransom Place, and that would have made it easy for them to accomplish this. Now, tearing down historic Bethel AME Church, that would have been a fight, but they probably would have won.
Mm-hmm.
Built a stadium there. This is the stadium that they built down here next to the natatorium.
So this
see, that was a Black and Gypsy neighborhood where that all that is.
Hmm.
Where you go to the State Museum and Washington Street used to go straight. It didn't curve and go down here and cross. It went straight right through where the State Museum is. And that neighborhood to the south was poor white and gypsy. And the neighborhood to the north was Black.
Hmm.
So all around there where it started becoming Black all down in here. And these kids went to school 5. and they tore down School 5 and they kept the facade because it was historic. And they reconstructed that facade inside the State Museum. So when you go in the State Museum, you see School
The
5.
school. Wow. The
You
more
see
you
that
know.
school? That facade
Yeah.
here in the atrium,
Uh-huh.
that's where it was. That's what School 5
Wow.
was. That was a neighborhood. But see, it's so wiped out that it's kind of hard to imagine that there were, you see these streets down here where it says law school?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Streets. These are all streets up and down here.
Where people used to live until the university came through. It's like, no.
Yeah, so all we got now is a few historic markers.
Yeah,
That's sickening.
yeah,
But you see all these streets back behind here. You can see them. And they just drew the lines right on top of them. They don't give a shit. You know, you see the canal going through there. You see the
Yeah.
canal going through there. They
Yeah.
don't give a shit if this is a church or a black school or what.
Right. They just know it's in the way.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
it was a school right here. All this stuff is just in the way. We got to get these people out of here, man. You know, because they can go to their suburbs.
Right. So it's a good point because it's like they you know what's the old phrase, you have people who ask for permission, some people ask for forgiveness, or what is it, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission.
Mhm.
So they
Mm-hmm.
just
And
draw
we are the unforgiven.
right. Like they just draw it up, and like later on they'll fake a forgiveness, like, okay, well, you know, and we know it's all BS, but they'll fake some type of reconciliation, but they're gonna do what they're gonna do. That's
Mhm.
the state's gonna do what it wants to do. And this is like a great demonstration of it, because I'm pretty sure that they didn't talk to anybody. They just drew this up. This is what we want to do. And like you said,
I mean, ladies and gentlemen, this is the Walker Theater right here, where my cursor is, in the middle of the fucking interstate, in between the interstate. Now, were they going to tear it down, or were they going to just leave it there? And because this is elevated, so I can go under it and get to the Walker. I don't know what the plan was. If they're going to tear it down or leave it up. But here it is. That's the Walker Theater where my cursor is.
so it would have been like under the roads, or would it have been right beside the highways, like when you're driving by, like it is now?
It would have been in between. It would have been like, here's north down, and here's
Kind of how
south.
they have Methodist with the monorail things kind of going between it.
Yeah, it would have been, maybe 3 or 4 lanes of freeway going southbound on one side of it, and 3 or 4 lanes of freeway northbound going around up, and then just the green space in between.
Which would have totally depleted the quality of entertainment you would even be able to get there unless they do a whole renovation on the inside to soundproof it from all of that traffic.
Yeah, that would have been horrible. I mean, it wouldn't even have made
That would have killed the Walker.
yeah,
It
it
would have
wouldn't even
killed
have made
it.
sense to keep it there. I
You
mean,
give a shit
they've
about no Walker.
You definitely don't give a shit about the Walker.
Obviously not.
The quicker they get the
Walker
niggas
ran
out, the
someplace
better
neighborhood.
parking lot the university would have.
So one last question on highways. So what was the impact that had on Black neighborhoods, just the highway constructions?
Well, it's extremely destructive because cities are like organisms in a way. They're like the bodies, and we are like cells as part of these organisms. And when you have an area that's disrupted, that undermines the health of that part of the body. And neighborhoods work the same way. With the I-60, especially in the Northwest corridor where I-65 came in, not only did it just go right through the heart of the Black community, but it was an elevated and solid piece that was opaque. In Detroit, for example, they tried to depress the interstates as a way to at least provide some semblance of community. I could at least see my friends across, but we didn't care less about that. It was a budget job, just raise it up in the air and then allow a few streets to pass through here and there, like 25th and 29th and 30th, but in general, it's just a solid piece of land that cut right through the heart of the Black community. My family church where I was born at Simpson United Methodist Church. Well, I wasn't born there, but my mother was an organist there when I went into labor, when she went into labor with me. I was born at St. Vincent's right down the street. But that was a merger of three churches that were all, well, two of the three were torn down as a result of that interstate. Right there around Senate and 13th Street in that area there. And because of the fact that that's all cut through there, it lowers the quality of life for the people that remain, because I'm just sitting next to a berm that's 100 feet tall, and so my property is useless, and so it's not just the properties that are taken out by the freeway itself, but it's the residual land value is what developers use around in every direction that's undermined. You see that not only on the northwest side where a lot of us live, but on the northeast side where a lot of us lived, and on the south side where we had a predominantly Black and Jewish population down there below Senate, down in that area. That area was undermined as well. And it changes the character. It cuts off connections. You don't even know that there was a relationship there because it's just gone. And it doesn't take long for our memory to be erased as well, that those places even existed. The canal, this thing just kind of ran over the canal. The canal actually continued through where the interstate was and on up to a viaduct or aqueduct that actually passes over just west of Watkins Park and then continued on towards the Northwest Corridor there. All that was destroyed or cut up. And then so what happens is people come in there and speculators come in and buy this land for cheap, and they put residential structures in there and warehouses and things that have access to the interstate so that it can move projects in and out. And
that's you end up with toxic waste and environmental problems with that, right?
Yeah, add that to it. Yeah. And then of course, they're not hiring, these places don't hire from the community, and they just put a chain link fence with barbed wire across the top and put some dogs or maybe an ostrich in there to run around and chase people off. And that's basically what we have all over adjacent to these cities. That whole corridor, all along I-70, is just really unsightly.
Can you kind of help paint a picture of what the political climate was at the time that Unigov was being formed?
Well, and then again, that also goes back to the end of World War II as well, from a planning perspective. I cannot honestly say here that Unigov was a deliberate act to erode the power of the Black community. I think that was certainly, I don't even think it was considered. Nobody even gave a damn. They just did it.
Yeah.
Which is worse in some ways.
It's like a byproduct of what was going to happen.
Yeah. But if we go to cities all over the Midwest or even all over the country, just like with the interstates, and look at these patterns, we see the same patterns over and over again. White flight, particularly after World War II and the GI Bill, and being able to have access to mortgages and build new houses in subdivisions. I mean, Levitt towns were in Pennsylvania and out in New Jersey and outside of New York, but there were Levitt towns everywhere. In Detroit, 100% of these suburbs had racial covenants in them. Not just 90%, but 100. St. Louis was the same way.
Can you just for listeners, can you tell people what racial covenants are? Just in case if somebody doesn't know what that means.
I'm sorry. Racial covenants are essentially a deed. On the deed, it would prohibit people of color, particularly Black people and Jews, from purchasing homes in these, and those racial covenants are still on deeds. We have them here in Muncie because even if they're illegal and they can, it can be enforced. They're still on the deed. You have to hire an attorney to have them removed. Otherwise, they're just still there. We got folks that are
Wow.
buying houses and they still have racial covenants on their deed. And so they would, especially, I mean, one of the most profound documentaries is called Crisis in Levittown. And you can just find it on YouTube or on any place and just see the attitudes that people had about escaping from the city and about not having Black people in their neighborhood. There was one veteran that moved into this neighborhood and they gave him hell into Levittown, which is a community of 30,000. I mean, it's huge. And we did the same thing here. They did the same thing in Milwaukee. We did the same thing in Detroit, same thing in St. Louis. But the way that these cities are organized historically, every city is different. And Indianapolis had its own unique setup as a city that was kind of had some strange boundaries from pretty peculiar annexations over time, like Broad Ripple, for example. And then it had these little towns all throughout Marion County and unincorporated areas, all that were all sprawling. And that's where people were moving to. In the Washington Township, Wayne Township, Decatur, Franklin, all around Warren. And Indianapolis actually encroached into those townships, the city limits. So Center Township was not just Indianapolis. I mean, it went up into Washington and it went out all the way out in Warren, almost all the way to the county line, and some of it went, and so essentially the IPS school district was the same as the borders of the city of Indianapolis. It was the city of Indianapolis school system. And in the 1960 census, I think Indianapolis had a population somewhere around 427,000 or somewhere. In the 1970 census, because of Unigov, it had a population of 744,000. So we talk about a 250 person increase, but it was actually just, of course, censuses are taken every 10 years. It was a major jump. And it suddenly thrust Indianapolis into being the 11th largest city in the United States. But it's really a misleading statistic because Indianapolis is not the 11th largest city in the United States, and it wasn't then. It was just that by population. You look at a city like Atlanta. Atlanta has a population of 500,000, but a metropolitan area that's pushing 6 million. Yeah. So it's a different situation in each of these things.
Yeah, when you control for metropolitan area, Indianapolis is not nowhere near 11th in the country. So. But
when we became 11th, we were like 33rd as far as metropolitan population, because there wasn't a lot around it. There wasn't a lot around. There wasn't a high population in Hamilton County or Johnson or any of the other ones that touch Marion County.
Well, Hamilton County.
Yeah, because if you go to like you said Atlanta or DC, DC is not actually that big of a city like by itself, but the metropolitan area is huge. San Francisco, the Bay Area is like this. I mean, there's so many cities around the country that are built, for better or worse in that sense. But Indianapolis essentially did. It sounds like Indianapolis essentially just collapsed the metropolitan area into a city. Is that a fair?
In 1970, that's basically what it did. And of course, one of the issues with Unigov is there were all kind of caveats to that. I'm thinking, trying to imagine myself as a person that was fleeing the inner city and moving out to these unincorporated areas or places like New Augusta or out. And I moved out there for a reason. And I am not going to move out there and then become part of that same city again. So then there became exceptions. Okay, we'll agree to this, but we're not going to include the schools because I'm not going to have my children in the same school district as those brown people in the inner city. That's why I'm out here.
Right.
I really think the schools are at the center of all of it in every city, because that's where the biggest degree of fear is, especially at the high school level. When people reach puberty and then all of a sudden those sleepovers are cut off, the game's over.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You know, and so we had these townships all around the perimeter of Center Township that IPS encroached on. And then we had 4 holes. We basically have 4 Swazilands in the middle of the city. Speedway, Lawrence, Beach Grove, and Southport.
Yep.
Now they are part of the county and part of, but they're independent, you know, with the exception of Speedway. They have mayors, but they also can vote for our mayor. They have a city council representation on the city county council as part of the county. But they have their own and their own schools. So when I started working on Concord Village in Hallville, there were 33 public schools in Indianapolis in Marion County. 33.
What year was this?
This would have been like 1994 when I was working out in Hallville, because I had to deal with almost all of them.
Right.
33 of them that I had to negotiate. And I'm thinking about the fact that because of the fact that Indianapolis became Marion County with the 4 holes in it and other exceptions, including police and fire, we basically had a diamond within a square. And suddenly it was determined that IPS was hyper segregated, which it was. It was hyper segregated, but now it's hyper segregated because it's part of this larger city. So you basically got this black diamond in the middle of this white square, you know, or as George Clinton would say, you know, chocolate city in the midst of this vanilla suburb.
Right. Going back to the time, I know, I think in 67, just to give a breakdown of what Unigov kind of did to the school system. In 67, the school population was 108,000, almost 109,000 students in 1967, and now IPS, the same district, is 30,000 students. So that's a major drop off, despite the fact that you said post 1970 the city actually added 250,000 people. So how do we go from 109,000 before Unigov, where there was less population, to 30,000 today? Like how do we get there? And how does Unigov, you know, since you said that's kind of the central component, how does that influence that?
Well, you know, we had sprawl, people continuing to move out. And then when we started moving out, then folks would move further out. So not only were they moving out in Marion County, now they're starting to move into the surrounding counties. Now they're starting to move to Zionsville. Now they're starting to move to Carmel. Fishers had 7,000 people in 1990. And then by 2010, it had 70,000. You know, moving out east on I-70, moving out west to Avon, moving down south to Greenwood and Frankfurt, and every direction they could move, run for the hills, as Obama would say. They're running for the hills.
Good old white circle.
And so even in the county schools, you take Washington Township, which likes to tout itself as being integrated. And so it actually wasn't part of the one-way busing because it was the township was about 40% Black, but within that township was segregation. And of course, it has one high school, North Central. So what do? They maintain segregation within a desegregated environment through gifted and talented programs and inquiry and stuff. You go out there and you walk in a classroom and everyone's Black in one and everyone's white in the other and Asian. So that's the game that's being played out there. Otherwise, they would move out. They would split and leave Washington Township to.
You're saying
they could be in a segregated white environment within a predominantly a school that's got diversity.
Sorry to cut you off. I just wanted to stop. Like you said, they use gifted and talented programs to segregate within the schools.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's not based on any kind of scientific evidence. It's based on PTAs and other clubs. I was in My daughter went through Washington Township, and she got to elementary school, just started at Crooked Creek, and they had her in the ordinary class. And then, what did they get tested in? There was no test. They just put them in there. And then all these gifted and talented students were in a different classroom. And that carried right on through the high school. So it's a way to maintain segregation. And there's no interest since 1954 in desegregating our schools. And that's why I was saying earlier that George Wallace's proclamation, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, was more prophetic than I Have a Dream speech, because it's accurate.
Yeah.
It's what is desired.
Unfortunate facts.
And even with all these people moving back to the inner city, that's fake, because what you have are empty nesters and young people and no children. Let's say I'm a typical suburbanite that's living off of Mass Avenue somewhere, and I'm having my little latte, and I meet somebody, and we decide to get together, and we even have a kid, and everybody's walking down Mass Avenue with their little strollers, and oh, that kid is so cute. But where's that kid going to go to school? I'll be damned if he's going to go to IPS. But can I afford $8,000 a semester to send him to St. Richard's? No, I'm probably going to move out to Fisher's and get me a 72-inch high privacy fence and let them live in that environment with my Genie garage door opener. And then when I get old enough to after sitting in a car for 2.5 hours a day for 30 years and all stressed out and don't have any kind of family structure, I get a divorce and I move back down to the inner city as an empty nester. So these are not even real communities. This is artificial. And so what we have in the 70s, what we had was a donut. And now we have a donut with a donut hole in the middle of it. Nothing in between but a post-industrial wasteland.
And with that in mind, what would you say is the most, or what's the most major economic impact of that segregation that was created within our city, as far as the growth of specifically the Black community?
I grew up in the Butler, Tarkenton, and Meridian Kessler area.
I have friends out there.
Got friends out there. That's where I grew up.
Yeah.
And my parents got divorced when I was in the second grade, and I moved from. Neither one of my parents could continue to afford to live there. They both were teachers in IPS, and we moved. I moved with my mother from there to 34th and Sherman, and so I went to school one. And what I saw was a transition from white to Black in less than 5 years, 100% transition. And then declining home values and abandonment with the schools. Kids, and then with this one-way busing thing, children living in that area being bused out to Decatur Central.
That definitely happened in the Butler Tarkington area.
Yeah, busing out to Decatur, or busing out to Franklin or other school systems where we weren't even welcome. And it's all about money. I profess that if I was a Klansman and I owned Bluebird Bus, I would be the greatest advocate for busing ever. I would be out there supporting this idea of desegregation, because it's not about education. It's not about equity. It's about money.
Right.
And it always has been, and it always will be. And they've basically given up on that. So our schools are as segregated as they were in 1954 in general across the country.
Right. And it seems like the schools are for one, we know that with public schools, it's tied to property value. So there's always a game of consolidating property value in a given neighborhood, so the school can be good even when it was public. And then we've seen the rise of, I was just reading the other day about the Christian school movement to become private schools, and that literally pops up right after Brown versus Board. And then we see charter schools, and I know that we don't want to go too down the road in the charter schools because that's a whole nother episode, but we see these creations of these new models. But I think sometimes people confuse segregation with it just being about white people just not wanting to be around black people because they think we stink, and like that's part of it. But I think I think
Even though it's them.
yeah, like what gets lost is just what gets lost is the economic part, right? Like the fact that this is a way to control power and this is a way to maintain power.
I was sitting in a room with a couple of young, brilliant Black planning students at Ball State. One of the name is Nate Easy. He's working with a firm here in town called Meticulous. He's an urban designer. And the other's name was Josh Sims. Nate Easy was a ball player out at Northwest High School, and Sims came down from Gary, and they were sitting in a room, and I drew a map of Gary and Lake County and a map of Marion County and Indianapolis and its surrounding counties. And I said, pick your poison. Because at the same time that this was happening in Indianapolis, what was happening in Gary?
Right.
Hatcher had been elected about the time that Lugar was elected. And those folks were fleeing from Gary and moving out to unincorporated areas in Lake County. And Hatcher was kind of coming from a perspective of Black nationalism. He's like, fine, go. If that's what you want to do, if you feel that you got to go, go. This is our city now. But they took their stuff with them.
Right.
They took all those business with them. And within 5 years, all of the businesses closed and we found ourselves going out there to shop at the mall on 30. Basically, the central business district of Gary became Highway 30 out there. And then, of course, their ice is colder, and we find ourselves falling out there too. So Maryville now is 50% Black.
Right.
So they move further out. They move to Crown Point. They move to Cherville. They move as far out as they can get, but they're still coming in there and working at U.S. Steel or going to Chicago or whatever they do on a daily basis, catching the South Shore. And what's left is a city that's deprived. And as a child, I'm struggling with, you see people say, well, look at what happens when we move in. No, that's not what happens when we move in. That's what happens when the rug is pulled out from under you.
Mm.
And it contributes to feelings of self-hatred and lack of self and lack of confidence and lack of even concern about life or death. And that contributes to crime rate and high murder rate and all the other challenges that we're facing in the inner city.
Right. So this is
all this stuff is working together, and the prison industrial complex is just sitting there waiting on all of us.
Right. So
and that's profitable, right? I mean, that's all about money. It's an industrial complex. It's not about law enforcement.
Right.
It's not about justice. It's about just us.
Unigov, to my understanding, the way it was passed was, we referenced that article. It was passed undemocratically, so it wasn't a public referendum. This wasn't something that the citizens that lived in the former Indianapolis were even able to vote on. Right. This was, if I'm correct, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, this is something that was kind of a deal made with Dick Lugar and business owners. So can you talk a little bit about just also the undemocratic part of it that went into how this played out? It wasn't just that they did it. It wasn't like we had an opportunity to really vote on it or say anything. It was just something that was imposed.
Probably a decision that was made in the back of St. Elmo's or something.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of decisions were made, and I've actually witnessed it. And so, yeah, and of course, some would suggest that it was a Republican move to strengthen the Republican Party because a lot of those who had fled were no longer living in the city. But if I can get them back by making the city the county, then all of a sudden, we'll have control of the city council. We'll have control of the mayor's office for years to come. And essentially they did from the time it happened in 1969 all the way up to like 94 or somewhere, 92, before we had a Democrat in the mayor's office again. Of course, Hudnut was mayor forever, 16 years, I believe, 4 terms.
Yeah.
But Lugar, Hudnut, and then I think we got Bart Peterson. And
Bart.
suddenly, because of that expansion in population, the Black population percentage went from like 30% down to like 16% or some low number, because now, and of course, we did have a few folks living out in Washington Township, but that was really about it, outside of some old settlements that have been here since the time we weren't allowed to live in the state in the first place.
Right. And it's funny, the population is back up to about 30% because everybody left again anyway.
Yeah, here we go again.
Yeah.
So what do? Do we have a metropolitan government? You know what I'm I'm in support of, if we're going to have a metropolitan tax base, and I can, if I'm out there in Carmel or Westfield or moving further out all the way up to Elwood, and I'm in the metropolitan area, I'm paying taxes to support Indianapolis public schools.
Mm-hmm.
And I should have a vested interest in it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
They're never going to go for that. But
Absolutely not ever.
Just like they weren't going to go for two-way busing.
Right.
I mean, I'm not going to send my kids to school 48. I mean, I moved out here for a reason, to get away from them.
Right.
Just like just like my father did. And in Gary, in 1945, they had an assembly. They had a strike. They had a strike in the 1920s, and then they had a strike in the 1940s. Basically, the kids are the ones that had to strike in the 1920s, had a strike in the 1940s. And there was a group in Gary called the Anselm Forum. And they brought in Frank Sinatra to come and sing at the Gary Memorial, Gary School's auditorium, because they had a shared auditorium that held 6,000 students. And they brought those striking students in there, and he sang, and he shamed them. He sang this song called "The House I Live In," and he shamed them for this strike. And they were screaming and howling and hooping and loving Sinatra. And then as soon as he left, they went right back to striking.
Wow.
Striking the possibility of Black people coming to Emerson or Edison or Wallace or any of those schools. I mean, they started out with that. They invented segregation in Indiana, in the school system, when the first Negroes arrived in Gary, when the city was just opening in 1906. They put a handful of Black students that came there into a trailer next to a liquor store.
Wow.
Until 20 years later, they could build Roosevelt.
And you're saying you said they invented it, or you saying that was one of the earliest?
Wirt, who was a DePaul graduate, was the superintendent of schools, and he introduced the idea of school segregation in Gary. We weren't just that long out of Plessy versus Ferguson. Yeah. And Gary became a national model for education around the country, not only for preparing people to work in factories, but also, to segregate. They were a model.
I didn't know that.
Because Indianapolis is really misleading. It looks like we talked about earlier, like a major city, and we realize that it really isn't. It looks like, okay, yeah, this city's not really as segregated as Gary is, but maybe it is. We should look at ethnic cartography maps of Indianapolis. It's not impressive at all.
Right. So like you kind of touching on it, and we had a question about Black cities in general, or what is framed as Black cities. I don't know, Shel, if you want to take that one, but
not the question that you didn't write out all the way after you told me you were going to write it out all the way when we got off.
Just ask the one that's on there.
Mm-hmm. So how does the urban? No. I can read now. I'm gonna use my IPS skills.
Yeah, you got through there, huh? You got through there.
I got through there, Alex graduate. So how does the urban planning of Indianapolis compare to cities such as Cleveland, St. Louis, and Detroit?
same. Just the same story, different different results, different what am I trying to say? Just different structures of the same story. St. Louis has a population of somewhere around 314,000 people and a metropolitan population. And then St. Louis County and the metropolitan population somewhere around 2 million, maybe 1.8 million. It has 80 cities around it. And each of them has their own little jurisdiction. Each of them has a mayor. Each one of them has a city council. Some of them might have 10,000 people, but they have a structure. Ferguson was one of them. And of course, Ferguson wasn't 80% Black, but 80% Black people getting tickets there. Getting stopped, getting pulled over. But there's all these cities, and Indianapolis wasn't structured like that. Indianapolis had a city population of 744,000 when Unigov was passed, and had a metropolitan population of just over 1 million. And so it's different in that way. Detroit has gone, and Gary is just a microcosm of Detroit, from 1.9 million people, it was the fourth largest city in the country, down to just over 670,000 people. Gary has gone from 180,000 down to 67,000. Detroit's 84% Black, so is Gary. Situations are the same, it's just a different story. Just as the way it happened, different histories. Of course, Gary was created in 1906 after they had stolen the land from the Potawatomi and wiped them out. Detroit goes all the way back to the 17th century as a city. And there's a wonderful book by an author, Taya Miles, called The Dawn of Detroit, that talks about slavery in Detroit. Slavery of Black folks and slavery of indigenous peoples. That really talks about the roots of that city. So with those different kind of structures, what you can just do is just imagine the most sinister thing that a people could do, and it was done.
Right.
So Indianapolis is the same as Columbus. So it probably has more similarities to Columbus, Ohio, as far as its structure is concerned. But it will never be a chocolate city.
Ever.
Right. So kind of wrapping up, but I just finished helping somebody index a book. I wish I could give more of what was in it, but I don't want to take their talking points because they haven't put the book out yet. But it's called Geography is a Threat, and it covers like the history of so-called urban planning, or not even just urban planning, but just the way that, even going all the way back to the colonial era, and how there was always this idea of identifying populations and sticking them somewhere so that you could extract labor and capital from them, and then circulate it back for the sake of the empire. That's kind of the premise of it. The person we just had on our previous episode, Dr. Russell Mawad, he wrote that, but I don't want to give away too much of that because that's his book. But to that point about urban planning and the way cities are constructed, is this just the way that cities function under this kind of modern capitalism, where they move populations around? And then you'd also know that not just even Black populations, even though we often catch the brunt of it, but you also talked about indigenous people are kicked off the land because this is their land. Poor white people. And when you look at the construction of neighborhoods, there's often these racial makeups move and they change, but that isn't because people just left just because they felt like it. This is something that the cities are behind. So is that just the history? Is that just how this functions, or is there any other way of doing this?
I don't really have enough confidence in the United States of America and our history to imagine another way of doing it, because it started out wrong in the first place.
Right.
So it's almost like starting a marriage. out of infidelity, that thing, it's just not, and you can write all these wonderful, eloquent words and write a beautiful constitution and a beautiful preamble, but all of it's hypocrisy. So it just started out wrong in the first place, and it will forever be. And I profess in my writing that the United States is in jeopardy of collapsing under the weight of its own history.
Mm.
I believe that. And I'm not just saying that as a pessimist. This is just a reality, and we're seeing more and more evidence of it every day. So I study cities like Gary, Indianapolis, East St. Louis, Camden, New Jersey, Flint, Michigan, Detroit, Youngstown, Ohio, which is actually um, more of a poor white city, but has some of the same struggles that you would find in fourth world cities like Muncie or Anderson. Post-industrial, post-agrarian, post-developing. If they want to call the these so-called third world countries, which, obviously that's a problematic term, developing nations, if that's more politically correct, then the United States is a post-developing nation. And I believe that.
Mm.
So my upcoming publication is entitled Fourth World Nation, A Critical Geography of Decline. And if you go to a city like East St. Louis, you would say, man, there's no hope. And if there's no hope, why should I even get up in the morning?
Right.
Why should I even get up in the morning? So all we have left is enough. We just want to survive. We're talking about survival now. We're not talking about development. We're not talking about revitalization. We're just talking about survival in cities like East St. Louis.
Right.
And we're talking about survival in places like Brightwood.
Right.
We're talking about survival in Hallville.
Fourth world. Can you want to talk about that for, just to give people your theory on that?
Well, I was on a trip to Detroit with my students back in 2006. I did this trip called the Midwest Distress Tour, where we went and looked at. We went to Detroit, we went to Flint, we went to Gary, we visited Robert Taylor Homes and Stateway Gardens and Ida B. Wells in Chicago. We went to East St. Louis. We came back around and over the Rhine in Cincinnati, and then came back home. And when we were in Detroit, standing next to the Packard plant, after driving through spaces where Detroit has 113,000 vacant lots, that's basically more vacant lots than the old city limits of Indianapolis has lots.
Wow.
And then another 30,000 vacant structures. And then abandoned plants like the Packard plant that have been sitting there abandoned since 1953. Remember,
Whoa.
1943, when they were doing all this military work and Rosie the Riveter and all that, as soon as a black woman showed up on the job, they all walked off the job. Damn the military machine and what we were trying to do to liberate Europe or whatever, they walked off the job because the hatred of us went much greater than the hatred of Hitler.
Mm.
But that plant's been sitting vacant since 1953, just wide open for little kids to go and play in very unsafe places.
Right.
The young lady said to me, one of my graduate students who was international, said, I am from what you in the West like to call the third world. And I'm going to tell you something, I have never seen anything like this in my life.
Mm.
This is the most decrepit environment I've ever seen in all my travels. And I said, it's beyond the so-called third world, isn't it? It's like a fourth world. And that just stuck with me. And I've been writing on fourth world and lecturing on it and trying to understand fourth world space ever since. And what I'm understanding is it's not just the despair and the abandonment, institutional, social, and physical abandonment that we experience as the so-called wretched of the earth.
Shout out
It
to
is the
Fanon.
disparity between that and the opulence. It's the disparity that's ever growing.
Yeah.
That's leading to the collapse of this nation.
Yeah.
If that disparity continues to grow, and it is, then we don't have a country left.
Right.
What's going to happen? It's not going to be like a Bolshevik revolution where we're just running around. Well, maybe it will, consider what happened on the 6th of January, but it's going to be
Well,
it's going to be something else that we don't even understand yet, and we need to be prepared for it.
Right. So it's empire collapsing on itself. That's what it sounds like.
You know,
Um,
we're following the path of the Roman Empire,
right.
and like Caesar said, you know, keep them distracted, man. Give them bread and circuses. Build arenas. What are we doing? We're building stadiums. Everybody's just concerned about whether or not the Colts are going to win this weekend.
Right.
And we'll build a stadium and tear it down in 20 years. And we'll use taxpayer money to build it. And but it's still kind of privately owned.
mm-hmm.
There's only one public owned NFL stadium in the country.
Packers, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Green Bay.
Yeah.
Here's Detroit, with a city that was $18 billion in debt, the largest municipal bankruptcy in the history of the planet. And they found the money to build Little Caesars Arena. Because
After
when
being $18 billion in debt.
running 18 billion, yes. When they were leaving the city and going out to the suburbs, they took all their teams, they took everything with them. You know, the Lions were playing in Pontiac at the Silverdome. The Pacers were fighting against the Detroit Pistons in Auburn Hills.
Yeah.
All that stuff has been brought back downtown to Detroit after declined to a point where you could get it for pennies on the dollar. And we're doing the same thing in Indianapolis.
Yeah. So they even kind of to bring all this full circle, even when we were talking about the construction of roads, if you segregate people, specifically Black folks, the property devalues, and then when the state wants to come in and buy it up because they want to build some, the property value is so low they can buy it up for essentially nothing, usually not even giving people the market value of their homes in some cases. They can buy it up, build a highway through it, because they're not going to buy quote unquote expensive land, you know, in and of itself. So it's no different than when you devalue the downtown district by white capital or white flight, you know, leaving, and then, you know, okay, we'll buy up this cheap land. I mean, this is how colonies function. so it's just like, it's no different.
We live in a colony.
Yeah, we do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, and as a colonial subject, there's nothing that I want more than something I can't have. You know, and that you know, that makes me question lunch counters and all of that part of the civil rights movement. You know, why do I want to have the right to eat at some place where I'm not welcome, and then abandon my place because I believe that their ice is colder? And I go out there and I say, you know, I see what's going on out here. You know, I was growing up in the days when our women were working, cleaning the floors and changing diapers, and, you know, all the bus lines, what's now Metro or whatever it's called, the bus lines, you know, they were taking women in uniform out to these places out in Meridian Kessler and all the way out to St. Vincent's Hospital area. Those buses were packed full of Black women going out there to work in these houses. And sometimes we go out there with them as children, and we'd see all this opulence and say, well, damn, what about me?
Right.
I live over there by Riverside Park, a park that I can't go to. You know, I see those kids having fun on those roller coasters and screaming. I can hear them screaming, but I can't even go in there. Maybe one day a year. Or I live up by the Rivy, and I'm sitting there watching those kids play tennis and have a good time, but I can't go in there. And so I want to go in there because it must be something good, because it's prohibited for me to do it.
Right.
And so in our minds, we're washed into believing that their ice is colder, and we just can't wait to get there. So we can't wait to move out to what we call the Golden Ghetto. And the only reason we even were able to do that was because of the Jewish population.
Right.
Because they were like, I'll sell it to them. I don't care.
And for people listening, that was
I get my money.
right. For people listening, the Golden Ghetto was a real place in Indianapolis. That's not a random term. Like that was a real neighborhood in the city. Back in what, the 40s?
Yeah, we had all those forces working against us, and that just made it ripe for the neighborhood to decline rapidly, and for institutional abandonment to be there. And it was School 4 and all these institutions. The churches moved out there. Everything moved out there. Witherspoon moved out there. Simpson moved out there. All these churches moved out there, and they're still moving out there. We just lost Mother Bethel that Black people built in 1869. That massive church down there in Vermont was built by Black hands in 1869. Where is it now?
Yeah.
Where's Second Baptist?
Right.
Gone.
IUPUI is there though.
Yeah. Forever and always.
Yeah.
Bethel is
destroying
now
Black legacies step by step.
Boutique hotel.
Say that again.
I said Bethel is now a Patel boutique hotel. And Second Baptist is now a condominium.
Yeah.
People always talk about Bugs Temple. Bugs Temple inherited that church after the interstate was built and the Methodist church moved out. That's Simpson Methodist Church that was burned down and then rebuilt by Black hands in the early 1920s. All that's gone.
I think we laid it out fairly well. Why these type of, it's not just Unigov really is a policy. Unigov, like you said earlier, probably wasn't even ultimately thought of as like, we're going to get rid of the Black people. Like that wasn't actually the conception of that particular policy, but the idea of just, we want to do what we're going to do, and Black people got to catch an L in the process, then so be it. And that's been, that's been the kind of colonial mentality since the beginning. So we can wrap it up. If there's any last words anybody wants to add, Dr. Dotson, Shell, go ahead, and then we can wrap it up from there.
Well, I just want to say that the biggest loser in all of this has been our children. What happened to IPS is a international disgrace, and our children suffered, and now years go by and they're having children, and their children are suffering, and their children are suffering from their suffering. So it becomes an intergenerational problem, and it's reduced the quality of life for all of us. So I think that in this country, yes, I think that Unigov was horrible, particularly when it resulted in a hyper-segregated school system that led to one-way busing to township schools, and they benefited greatly from that. But the alternative is Gary, and what happened in Lake County, and what happened to those poor children that are abandoned in similar ways. Roosevelt is probably going to come down, and Roosevelt is the Crispus Attucks of Gary. So I'll just say this one last thing. I worked on this large public housing revitalization project in Hallville called Concord Village, Eagle Creek, and people were living there, and we tore it down and rebuilt it, and made single family homes that actually are apartments, but they look like homes. We built 244 new homes in Hallville. But while it was being built, those kids were being bused to 33 different schools. Half of them were going to Wayne Township schools. So they were going to the feeders. They were going to the elementaries. They were going to the middle schools and to Ben Davis. The other half of them were being bused in IPS. Some of them were going all the way to School 59 over on Kessler and Keystone, all the way over there
Whoa.
from Hallville. So because IPS is trying to maintain a balance and desegregation as well within the school system. So they were being bused. And sometimes they would even split up siblings. I got one child going to Wayne Township. I got another one going to IPS in the same household.
What?
And those kids didn't even know each other because by the time they got home late in the evening, it was just time to go to bed.
Right.
It was late, and they're getting up in the dark and standing out there waiting for a bus to come and get them. So I had one young lady who was, I said, she was going to Ben Davis or to Ben Davis Junior High School. And I said, she's going to be living in Hawthorne Place apartments on 32nd and Emerson while we're rebuilding their house. So what I like to do is send her to IP. I'm talking to the superintendent of schools at Wayne Township. So I would like to send her to IPS school out there just during that time. And he said, "Oh no, we'll come and get her." I said, "You're gonna go all the way out to 32nd and Emerson and pick up this young lady and send her to Ben Davis?" He said, "Yeah, no problem. I mean, we love all our children." He had me. I walked out of there and said, "Wow, they're really dedicated to these kids. They want to keep them." IPS paid tuition for those kids to go out there, and IPS paid for the transportation. So he would have lost $1,800 if I had let that girl go to an IPS school while they were rebuilding her house in Hallville.
Wow.
This thing was about money.
You about to take his summer bonus.
And for people listening, you're talking literally about opposite sides of the city, like that, like east and west.
Yeah, about 20 miles.
Yeah,
22 miles each way. And so IPS was, it was like they were being punished for being hyper segregated. The school system was punished. They had to pay for the transportation and the tuition. They had to pay tuition for those kids to go, and it was $6,000 per grade per year going to these schools, going to Decatur Central, going to Franklin Central, going to Wayne Township or Warren. It went on for 25 years.
Yeah.
And now they've kind of gave up on it, and let's just go back to being hyper segregated.
Right.
Because segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever.
Right. Yeah, and there's been no IPS never had a shot. I mean, a lot of people beat up on IPS, and there are reasons to beat up on IPS, no doubt. But
absolutely.
But
they were designed to fail.
Yeah, exactly. They were designed. That's a great way to put it.
All of this is designed to fail.
Yeah. So, IPS, and then you think about now with COVID and what how that's just further crippled schools. It's not getting any better. So yeah, I mean, I'm glad we were able to talk about all these things, but I'm glad we were able to really get into schools because that's something we haven't touched on much within our podcast.
Yeah, I'm just saying that there's a direct symbiotic relationship between all these social constructions and the social construction of race, and schools are at the middle of it. They're at the very center of it, and they've been here since we first landed on this continent.
Right. All right. Well, Shell, unless there's something else you want to add, thanks for being with us. This was very educational. I'm definitely going to make a hard push locally to make sure people listen to this. And thank you for everybody that's listening. Thank you to the library. And for the people who are listening, we have a Patreon. I'm not the greatest at promoting it, but we have a Patreon. So you can support our Patreon. It's just under Black Myths, Patreon/Black Myths, patreon.com/Black Myths. And that'll be, if you're watching this, that'll be at the bottom of your screen. And everything else, just appreciate it. This is the last episode of this series of Black Myths of Black History. But we'll be back next month. We don't know what that myth's gonna be just yet, or maybe we're just not telling you. But we'll be back next month here in March. But thank you again to Dr. Olin Dotson. Thank you to everybody that's been part of this series so far. Dr. Rasul Mawad, Dr. Sharice Burton-Stelly, and Dr. Jared Ball. I would encourage everybody to go back and listen to those myths that we talked with individually with all of them. And just thank you everybody for supporting. And again, thank you to the Center of Black Literature and Culture and the Indianapolis Public Library. This is the Black Myths Podcast, and we are out. Thank you.